the night my father tore the necklace from my throat and shattered more than just jewelry. 8 months later, his regret couldn't mend what was already broken. The music had been swelling, violins weaving through the chatter of guests, when the sudden violence of her father's hand cut through the air like a blade. One moment she was standing in the glow of chandeliers, the necklace cool against her skin, and the next it was torn away, beads scattering across the polished floor like tiny explosions. Gasps rippled through the crowd, the laughter of a moment before collapsing into silence. The weight of his words, spat with venom, seemed to echo louder than the orchestra, louder than the clinking glasses, louder than her own heartbeat that refused to steady itself in the aftermath of the shattering. And yet, beneath the humiliation, something darker began to stir. The necklace had been more than jewelry. It was a symbol of lineage, of expectation, of a chain that bound her to a legacy she had never chosen. When it broke, she felt the sting not only on her skin but deep in her chest, as though the air itself had been ripped away. Her father's face, red with fury, loomed over her, his voice carrying across the hall with the authority of a man who had always believed his word was law. Guests shifted uncomfortably, torn between loyalty to tradition and the discomfort of witnessing cruelty dressed as righteousness. The silence that followed was not empty but heavy, pressing down on her shoulders like a verdict waiting to be delivered. Her brother, the groom, froze at the altar, his smile faltering as though he too had been struck. The bride's hand hovered uncertainly in his, her eyes darting between father and daughter, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. The guests whispered in hushed tones, their voices like rustling leaves, but no one stepped forward. It was as if the entire room had been paralyzed by the audacity of the act, unwilling to challenge the patriarch who had just declared his daughter unworthy. The protagonist stood rooted, her throat tight, her hands trembling at her sides, the broken chain dangling like evidence of a crime she had not committed. Her partner, seated near the front, rose instinctively, eyes blazing with both anger and fear. He took a step forward, but her father's glare cut him down before he could speak. The words hurled at him were sharp, accusing him of poisoning her, of corrupting her, of dragging her away from the purity she was meant to embody. The accusation hung in the air, a curse disguised as truth, and the partner's fists clenched at his sides, powerless against the storm of authority that had been unleashed. The protagonist's silence was not weakness, but survival, a choice to endure rather than ignite further destruction in a room already trembling with tension. The shattered necklace lay scattered across the floor, pearls rolling into corners, beads crushed beneath the heels of startled guests. Each fragment seemed to carry a piece of her history, a reminder of the countless times she had been told who she was supposed to be. The sight of it broken should have filled her with despair, but instead, there was a flicker of something else, an ember of defiance that had long been smothered beneath obedience. The humiliation was undeniable, but so too was the strange sense of release that came with the destruction of the symbol that had weighed on her for so long. Her father's voice thundered again, declaring her a disgrace, a failure, a betrayal of everything he had built. His words were not just for her, but for the audience, a performance meant to preserve his authority in the eyes of the community. Yet, the more he spoke, the more the mask of control slipped, revealing not strength, but desperation. His need to dominate, to crush her spirit in front of witnesses, betrayed a fear he could not name. The guests, once silent, now exchanged uneasy glances, their loyalty to tradition beginning to fracture under the weight of his cruelty. The protagonist's mother sat rigid at a nearby table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. She did not move to stop him, did not speak to soften the blow, did not even look at her daughter. Her silence was its own betrayal, a quiet agreement with the violence unfolding before her. The protagonist felt the sting of that absence more sharply than the tearing of the necklace, for it confirmed what she had long suspected, that her mother's love was conditional, bound by the same expectations that had just been weaponized against her. The emptiness of that realization deepened the wound. The music had stopped entirely now, the orchestra frozen mid-note, their instruments lowered as though they too were witnesses to a crime. The bride's veil trembled as she whispered something to her new husband, but he shook his head, unwilling to challenge the man who had raised him. The protagonist stood alone, the center of a storm she had not summoned, her silence both shield and prison. Every eye in the room was on her, waiting for her to break, to cry, to beg for forgiveness. But she did not move, did not speak, did not give them the satisfaction of seeing her collapse. Her father's hand still clutched the broken chain, his knuckles white, his chest heaving with the effort of his rage. He looked at her as though she were no longer his daughter, but a stranger who had betrayed him in the most unforgivable way. The distance between them had never been greater, and yet it was measured not in steps, but in the chasm of values, of choices, of lives lived under different truths. The protagonist felt the weight of that distance settle into her bones, a heaviness that would not leave her even when the night was over. And then, as the silence stretched on, something shifted. The guests began to murmur again, not in support of her father, but in discomfort, in disapproval, in recognition that what they had witnessed was not strength, but cruelty. The protagonist lifted her chin, her eyes meeting her father's with a steadiness that surprised even her. She did not speak, but in her silence there was power, a refusal to be broken even as the necklace lay shattered at her feet. The night would not end here, but the fracture it created would ripple far beyond the walls of that wedding hall, carrying consequences no one yet dared to imagine. Her partner's voice had barely risen above the stunned murmurs when the father's snarl cut through the air like a whip. The words were not just an accusation, but a public branding, meant to scorch both of them in front of every witness. The venom in his tone carried the weight of years of control, of a man who believed his daughter was his possession to guard, to mold, to keep untouched by the world. The silence that followed was suffocating, as though the walls themselves recoiled from the ugliness of the moment, leaving the protagonist suspended in a haze of disbelief and humiliation that seemed to stretch endlessly. The partner's face flushed with anger, his jaw tightening as though he might lunge forward. But the force of the father's glare pinned him in place. The accusation of corruption was not just a personal attack, but a declaration of war, a line drawn in the sand that dared anyone to cross it. The guests shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between the two men, caught between the instinct to intervene and the fear of being scorched by the patriarch's wrath. The protagonist's body felt heavy, her limbs unresponsive, as though shame had turned her into stone while fury burned silently beneath her skin. The father's words echoed in her ears, each syllable hammering against her chest with cruel precision. To be called stolen, as though she were an object passed from one man to another, stripped her of her humanity in front of those who had gathered to celebrate love and unity. The sting of it was sharper than the tearing of the necklace, sharper than the gasps of the crowd, sharper even than the silence of her mother, who sat unmoving at the edge of the chaos. The protagonist's silence was not consent, but it was a silence that screamed louder than any words she could have spoken in that moment. Her partner's hand twitched at his side, aching to reach for her, to shield her from the storm. But he knew that any gesture would only fuel the fire. The father's eyes were wild, his chest heaving, his voice trembling with the desperation of a man who felt his grip slipping. The accusation was not about corruption, but about control, about the terror of losing the daughter he had shaped into an image of obedience. The protagonist could feel the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on her, waiting for her to break, to either defend her partner or collapse under her father's fury. The silence of the room was not empty but charged, like the air before a lightning strike. Guests who had moments ago been laughing and clinking glasses now sat frozen, their expressions caught between pity and discomfort. The bride's veil trembled as she whispered to her new husband, but he shook his head, unwilling to challenge the man who had raised him. The protagonist's brother looked torn, his eyes darting between his sister and his father, but he too remained still, bound by the invisible chains of loyalty and fear. The protagonist's fury grew with every second of their silence, a fire she could not yet release. Her father's words had not only accused her partner, but had reduced her to a possession, a prize that had been stolen from his grasp. The cruelty of it was not in the volume of his voice, but in the conviction behind it, the certainty that he was right and that the world would side with him. The protagonist's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow, her throat tight with the words she could not yet speak. She felt the sting of humiliation, but beneath it, a deeper rage began to take root, one that would not be silenced forever. Her partner's eyes met hers across the space, filled with both sorrow and determination. He wanted to fight, to defend her honor, but he also understood the cost of defiance in that moment. His restraint was not weakness, but a choice, a recognition that the battle unfolding was not his to win, but hers to endure. The protagonist's silence was not surrender, but a gathering of strength, a refusal to let her father dictate the terms of her response. The fury inside her was not yet ready to be unleashed, but it was there, simmering, Waiting. The father's voice cracked as he repeated his accusation, louder this time, as though volume could mask the fragility of his authority. His words no longer carried the same weight, no longer struck with the same precision, but instead revealed the desperation of a man who felt his power slipping through his fingers. The guests began to murmur again, their discomfort growing, their loyalty to tradition wavering in the face of such cruelty. The protagonist stood frozen, her silence now a defiance, her fury now a shield, her shame transforming into something sharper. The broken necklace still lay scattered across the floor, its fragments glinting under the chandeliers like shards of truth. Each piece seemed to reflect the fracture in the family, the rupture that could not be mended by apologies or time. The protagonist's eyes lingered on the fragments, her fury deepening as she realized that the destruction of the necklace was not the end, but the beginning of something larger. The silence of the room pressed in on her, but within that silence, she felt the stirrings of a power she had never claimed before. And as her father's voice finally faltered, his words losing their edge, the protagonist remained still, her silence louder than his accusations. She did not defend herself, did not defend her partner, did not give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she stood frozen in shame and fury, her silence a weapon sharper than any words she could have spoken. The room remained suspended in that moment, the weight of what had been said lingering in the air, carrying with it the promise of consequences that no one yet dared to imagine. She walked out of the hall with her head lowered, the sound of her heels echoing against the marble floor louder than the music that had once filled the room. No one followed her, no one called her name, and that silence was more deafening than any scream. The night air outside was cold, biting against her skin, but it felt cleaner than the suffocating atmosphere she had left behind. She did not look back at the glowing windows of the wedding hall because she knew if she did, she might falter, and faltering was no longer an option. The necklace fragments in her pocket pressed against her palm like thorns, each edge cutting deeper into her resolve as she walked into the unknown. Her partner caught up with her at the edge of the parking lot, his breath uneven, his eyes searching her face for some sign of what she was feeling. But she gave him nothing, not a word, not a tear, not even a glance that might betray the storm inside her. The silence between them was heavy, but it was not hostile. It was survival, a fragile thread holding them together in the wake of destruction. He reached for her hand, and though she let him take it, her grip was limp, her body still locked in the paralysis of shock. The broken necklace rattled faintly in her pocket, as if reminding her that the wound was still fresh. The drive away from the venue was long and quiet, the headlights cutting through the darkness like a blade. She stared out the window, her reflection fractured by the glass, her mind replaying the moment over and over again. Her father's face twisted with rage, his voice booming with accusations, the gasps of the guests, all of it looped endlessly, refusing to release her. She pressed her hand against her pocket, feeling the jagged edges of the necklace dig into her skin, grounding her in the reality that this was not a nightmare she could wake from. It was a scar being carved into her life in real time. When they reached home, she went straight to her room without turning on the lights. The darkness was a comfort, a shield against the weight of what had just happened. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she pulled the broken necklace from her pocket. The pieces glittered faintly in the dim light, sharp and unforgiving, like fragments of a life that had been shattered in front of everyone she had ever known. She closed her fist around them, the edges biting into her palm, and for the first time that night, she let herself feel the pain fully. Her phone buzzed with messages, missed calls from relatives, texts filled with half-hearted concern and veiled judgment. She ignored them all, letting the screen glow and fade, like a heartbeat she no longer wanted to hear. Each notification was a reminder of the ties she had severed, of the family that had chosen silence over her dignity. She turned the phone face down, burying it beneath a pillow, as though hiding it could erase the voices that had failed her when she needed them most. The broken necklace lay beside her, a cruel companion in the dark. Days passed, but the memory of that night clung to her like smoke, seeping into everything she touched. She avoided mirrors, unable to face the reflection of someone who had been stripped bare in front of the world. Her partner tried to comfort her, but she remained distant, her silence a wall he could not climb. She carried the necklace with her everywhere, tucked into her pocket or hidden in her bag, unable to let it go. It was not just a reminder of betrayal, but a symbol of the chains she had finally broken, even if the breaking had left her bleeding. Her family's absence became louder with each passing day. No visits, no apologies, only the occasional message that felt more like obligation than love. She realized then that the ties she had cut were not as strong as she had once believed. They had been fragile threads held together by fear and expectation. The necklace, once a symbol of belonging, was now proof of her exile. And yet, in that exile, there was a strange kind of freedom, a space where she could begin to breathe without the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. She began to notice small changes in herself, subtle shifts that hinted at something new taking root. The silence that had once suffocated her now became a canvas, a place where she could begin to paint her own story. She started writing late at night, pouring her thoughts onto paper, each word a release, each sentence a step away from the chains of her past. The broken necklace sat on her desk as she wrote, its jagged edges catching the light, a reminder that beauty could still exist in fragments. Her partner watched her carefully, giving her space but never leaving her side. He understood that healing was not something he could force, that her silence was not rejection, but a cocoon. He cooked for her, left notes on her desk, and sometimes just sat quietly in the same room, his presence a steady anchor in the storm. She did not thank him, not yet, but she felt the weight of his loyalty, and it steadied her in ways she could not yet name. The necklace remained between them, unspoken but ever present, a symbol of both the wound and the bond that was growing stronger in its shadow. And though she had left the wedding without a word, the silence she carried was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of something raw and uncharted, a path carved not by tradition but by defiance. The broken necklace in her pocket was no longer just a reminder of humiliation, but a relic of transformation, proof that she had survived the shattering. Each jagged edge whispered of pain, but also of resilience, of a future that would not be dictated by the hands that had tried to break her. The aftermath was not closure, but it was the seed of something that would one day grow beyond the ruins. The months that followed unfolded like a slow exhale after years of holding her breath. She and her partner moved into a small apartment with peeling paint and sunlight that spilled generously through the windows, a place that felt theirs in a way no family home ever had. Each morning began with quiet rituals, coffee brewing, laughter over burnt toast, the comfort of shared silence that asked for nothing but presence. Yet beneath the warmth of this new life, the memory of her father's rage lingered like a shadow that refused to leave the room, a ghost that sat silently at the edge of every joy. She found herself relearning the art of freedom, discovering how to make choices without the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. She cut her hair shorter, wore colors her father would have disapproved of, and filled the apartment with plants that grew wild and untamed. Each act was small, almost trivial, but together they became a rebellion, a declaration that she was no longer bound by the chains of obedience. Still, at night, when the world was quiet, she would feel the sting of his words echoing in her chest, reminding her that freedom was not without scars. Her partner became her anchor, steady and patient, never pushing her to speak of what she wasn't ready to share. He encouraged her to paint again, to lose herself in colors and shapes that had once been her refuge. The canvases filled quickly, each one a storm of emotion, rage in crimson, grief in muted grays, hope in bursts of gold. The act of creation was healing, but it also unearthed the pain she had buried, forcing her to confront the memory of that night in ways she could not yet put into words. The silence between brushstrokes was heavy, but it was also necessary. 8 months gave her distance, but not erasure. She no longer flinched at the sound of raised voices, but she still carried the memory of her father's hand tearing the necklace from her throat. Sometimes she would reach into her drawer and touch the broken pieces, their jagged edges biting into her skin, as if to remind her that the past was not gone, only hidden. She could not bring herself to throw them away, nor could she wear them again. They existed in limbo, much like her relationship with the family she had left behind. Her days grew fuller, her laughter more genuine, but the silence of her family was a wound that refused to close. No calls came, no apologies arrived. Only the occasional rumor passed through distant relatives that her father still spoke of her with bitterness. She told herself she didn't care, that she had built something stronger without them. But in the quiet moments, she felt the ache of absence. It was not longing for their approval, but grief for the love that had never been unconditional. That grief was a companion she could not shake. Her partner noticed the way her eyes sometimes drifted when they were surrounded by friends, the way her smile faltered when someone mentioned family. He never pressed, but he held her hand tighter in those moments, grounding her in the life they were building together. She admired his patience, his refusal to demand explanations, and yet she feared that her silence was a burden he carried quietly. The thought haunted her, the idea that her father's rage had not only scarred her, but had left ripples in the life she was trying to protect. The city around her became a kind of balm, its noise and chaos drowning out the echoes of the past. She walked through crowded markets, losing herself in the rhythm of strangers' lives, finding comfort in the anonymity of being just another face in the crowd. Yet, even there, she sometimes caught herself scanning for a familiar figure, half expecting her father's shadow to emerge from the throng. The fear was irrational, but it was real, a reminder that the past was not as far away as she wanted it to be. She began to write letters she never sent, pouring her anger and sorrow onto paper addressed to her father. Some were filled with rage, others with grief, and a few with the faintest trace of longing. She kept them hidden in a box beneath her bed, unread by anyone but herself. Writing them did not bring closure, but it gave shape to the silence, transforming it into something tangible. Each letter was a confrontation she could not have in person, a way of reclaiming her voice in the absence of reconciliation. Her partner sometimes found her staring at the box, her expression unreadable, but he never asked what was inside. Instead, he would sit beside her, offering his presence as a shield against the weight of memory. She loved him for that, for understanding, that healing was not linear, that silence was not emptiness, but a space where strength was slowly being rebuilt. Their life together was imperfect, but it was theirs. And in that imperfection, she found a kind of beauty her father could never have understood. And so, 8 months passed, each day layering over the last like brushstrokes on a canvas, creating a picture that was both fractured and whole. She was stronger now, freer than she had ever been, but the memory of her father's rage remained etched into her bones. It haunted her not as a chain, but as a scar, a reminder of what she had endured and what she had chosen to leave behind. The silence of those months was not empty. It was the space in which she began to rebuild herself piece by piece, even as the shadow of that night lingered at the edges of her new life. The phone rang just as the morning light spilled across the kitchen table, catching her off guard in the middle of pouring coffee. She almost didn't answer, the unfamiliar number stirring a hesitation that felt like instinct. But something in her chest urged her to pick up, and when she did, the voice on the other end froze her in place. It was her father, the man she had not heard from in 8 long months, his tone stripped of the thunder that once shook her world. His words trembled, fragile and uncertain, carrying none of the authority he had wielded so mercilessly at the wedding. For a moment, she thought she had misheard, that perhaps her mind was playing tricks on her, but the sound of his breath confirmed it was real. The man who had torn the necklace from her throat, who had spat accusations like venom, now spoke with a quiver that betrayed something she had never associated with him. Fear. "I need to see you." "Please," he said, the plea hanging in the air like a fragile thread. She gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles whitening, as if the device itself might shatter under the weight of his words. The silence that followed was unbearable, stretching between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross. She could hear the faint hum of static, the distant sound of his breath, and beneath it all, the echo of that night replaying in her mind. The broken necklace, the gasps of the guests, the humiliation that had burned her skin, it all came rushing back with the sound of his voice. Her lips parted, but no words came, her throat locked by the collision of past and present. The plea lingered, unanswered, demanding a response she wasn't ready to give. Her partner, seated across the table, looked up from his mug, sensing the shift in her expression. He didn't need to ask who it was. The way her body stiffened, the way her eyes darkened, told him everything. He leaned forward slightly, his presence steady, but he did not interrupt. This was her moment, her decision, and he knew better than to intrude. Still, she felt the weight of his gaze, a silent reminder that she was not alone, even as the voice on the other end tried to pull her back into a world she had left behind. Her father's words repeated, softer this time, as though he feared she might hang up. "Please." It was a word she had never heard from him before, not directed at her, not spoken with such fragility. It unsettled her, not because it was cruel, but because it was unfamiliar. This was not the man who had raised her with iron rules and unyielding expectations. This was someone else, someone stripped of certainty, someone reaching out from a place of desperation. and yet the memory of his rage still burned too brightly to be extinguished by a single plea. She closed her eyes, her mind torn between the past and the present. Part of her wanted to slam the phone down, to sever the connection as cleanly as she had severed the ties 8 months ago. Another part of her, smaller but insistent, wanted to listen, to understand what had driven him to this moment of weakness. The conflict churned inside her, a storm of anger and curiosity, of pain and the faintest flicker of something she refused to name. The silence stretched on, her father waiting, her partner watching. Her heart caught in the middle, the sound of his trembling voice cracked again. And for the first time, she heard something that unsettled her more than his rage ever had. Regret. It was not spoken outright, but it was there, woven into the tremor of his words, the uneven rhythm of his breath. He was not demanding, not accusing, not commanding. He was asking. And that shift, that reversal of power, left her unsteady, unsure of how to respond. The man who had once seemed unbreakable now sounded broken, and that truth pressed against her chest like a weight she could not ignore. Her fingers tightened around the phone, her pulse quickening as she realized that this call was not just about him. It was about her, about whether she was ready to face the man who had humiliated her, whether she could stand in front of him without collapsing under the weight of old wounds. The thought terrified her, but it also stirred something else, something she had not felt in months: control. For the first time, she held the power to decide, to choose whether to open the door or keep it closed. That realization was both liberating and terrifying. Her partner's hand reached across the table, resting gently on hers, grounding her in the present. She looked at him, his eyes steady, his expression calm, and felt the strength of the life they had built together. The call was a reminder of the past, but the warmth of his touch was proof of the present, of the freedom she had fought to claim. She drew in a breath, steadying herself, the phone still pressed to her ear, her father's silence waiting on the other end. The moment stretched, fragile and uncertain, as though the world itself was holding its breath. And in that fragile pause, she realized that no matter what she chose, nothing would ever be the same again. The call had cracked open a door she had sealed shut, and whether she stepped through it or not, the air had already shifted. Her father's trembling voice lingered in her mind, colliding with the memory of his rage, creating a tension that refused to be resolved. She did not yet know if she would see him, if she would allow him back into her life, but she knew this. The silence of the past 8 months had ended, and something new had begun to stir in its place. He was waiting for her at the edge of the cafe, shoulders hunched, his frame smaller than she remembered, as though the weight of his own choices had carved him down. The man who once filled every room with authority now seemed diminished, his eyes sunken, his hands trembling as they clutched the rim of a coffee cup he hadn't touched. She paused in the doorway, her breath catching at the sight of him. Because this was not the father who had torn the necklace from her throat. This was someone hollowed out, stripped of certainty, carrying the wreckage of his own rage like a burden he could no longer bear. When he finally looked up, his eyes met hers with a desperation that unsettled her more than his fury ever had. There was no fire in them now, only a pleading that seemed to reach across the space between them. His lips parted and the words came out cracked, fragile, almost broken. I want to take back what I did. I want my daughter back. The sound of it was jarring, not because of the apology itself, but because it came from a man who had never admitted fault, never bent, never begged. She stood frozen, her body rigid, her mind torn between disbelief and the sharp sting of memory. The cafe around them hummed with the ordinary rhythm of clinking cups and quiet conversations, but to her, the world had narrowed to this moment. She could still hear the echo of pearls scattering across the wedding floor, still feel the burn of humiliation on her skin, still taste the silence she had swallowed that night. His plea collided with those memories, creating a storm inside her that left her unsteady. She wanted to recoil, to turn away, but her feet remained rooted, as though some invisible thread held her in place. He leaned forward, his voice trembling as he repeated himself, softer this time, as though afraid she might vanish if he spoke too loudly. I want my daughter back. The words were heavy, weighted with regret, but also with a longing that unsettled her. For years he had demanded obedience, demanded purity, demanded silence. Now he was asking, not demanding, for something he had already destroyed. The irony of it twisted inside her, sharp and bitter, and yet she could not ignore the rawness in his tone. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. nails digging into her palms as she fought to steady herself. She wanted to scream at him, to remind him of the necklace, of the accusations, of the way he had stripped her of dignity in front of everyone she loved. But the words caught in her throat, tangled in the weight of his brokenness. He was no longer the towering figure who had loomed over her life. He was a man unraveling, and that unraveling left her with a power she had never held before. She studied him carefully, noting the way his shoulders sagged, the way his hands shook, the way his voice cracked under the strain of regret. This was not the father she had known, but a stranger wearing his face, a man who had been hollowed out by the consequences of his own cruelty. And yet beneath the regret, she sensed something else. Fear. Fear of being forgotten, fear of being left behind, fear of facing the silence he had created. That fear clung to him like a shadow, and she could feel it pressing against her, begging for acknowledgement. Her partner's presence lingered in her mind, the memory of his steady hand on hers when the call had come. She thought of the life they had built together, the freedom she had carved out of the ruins, the strength she had found in silence. To hear her father beg now was to be reminded of how far she had come, how much she had grown beyond the reach of his control. And yet, the plea stirred something she could not name, something caught between anger and sorrow, between rejection and the faintest flicker of compassion. The words, "I want my daughter back," echoed in her chest, but they did not land as he intended. They did not erase the past, did not mend the fracture, did not undo the humiliation. Instead, they revealed the truth she had long suspected, that his rage had never been about her, but about his fear of losing her. Now, that fear had become reality, and he was left with nothing but regret. She felt the weight of that realization settle into her bones, heavy and unyielding. She did not move closer, did not reach for him, did not offer the comfort he sought. Instead, she stood in the doorway, her silence louder than any words she could have spoken. His plea hung in the air, fragile and desperate, but she let it linger without response. The power was hers now, and she would not give it away so easily. The man before her was not the father she remembered, but a hollowed figure begging for something he could never fully reclaim. And as the moment stretched between them, she realized that this was not just his plea, it was a test of her own strength. To hear him beg was to confront the past in its rawest form, to stand face to face with the man who had broken her, and see him broken in return. The silence she held was not weakness, but choice, a shield forged from the pain he had given her. And though she did not yet know what she would do, she knew this. The balance between them had shifted forever, and nothing would return to what it once was. Her voice cut through the air with a sharpness that startled even herself, the words trembling but unyielding as they left her lips. For months she had carried the silence like a shield, swallowing the pain until it became part of her bones. But now it spilled out, raw and undeniable. "You didn't just break a necklace. You broke me. You broke us." The cafe seemed to fall still, the hum of conversation dimming as though the world itself paused to absorb the weight of her confession. Her father flinched, his eyes widening, the words striking him with a force his own rage had never managed to summon. The memory of that night surged back with brutal clarity. The tearing of the chain, the gasps of the guests, the humiliation that had burned her skin. But now, standing before him, she realized that the wound had not been confined to that moment. It had seeped into every corner of her life, shaping her silence, her distance, her grief. Her words were not just an accusation, but a truth laid bare, a truth that had been festering in the shadows for too long. And as they hung in the air, she felt the weight of them settle not on her shoulders, but on his. Her father's lips parted, but no sound came. The man who had once commanded every room with thunderous authority now sat mute, his face pale, his hands trembling against the table. He had expected anger, perhaps even forgiveness, but not this quiet devastation, this mirror held up to his cruelty. The silence between them was no longer hers to carry. It was his, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on him with the force of all the years he had refused to see her as anything but an extension of himself. She felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with release. For the first time, she had spoken the truth aloud, and it had landed with a finality that could not be undone. The words were not shouted, not hurled in rage, but spoken with a calm that made them all the more piercing. They were not meant to wound, though they did. They were meant to reveal, to strip away the illusion that his actions had been a moment of anger, rather than a fracture that had shattered everything between them. Her partner's presence lingered at the edge of her awareness, steady and grounding. But this confrontation was hers alone. She did not look to him for strength, because the strength was already within her, rising from the ashes of silence. Her father's eyes glistened, though whether from shame or sorrow she could not tell, and for a fleeting moment, she saw the man behind the mask, the man who had built his authority on fear, only to watch it crumble in the face of his daughter's truth. The cafe's ordinary sounds began to return, the clinking of cups, the low murmur of voices. But between them, the air remained charged, thick with the weight of what had been spoken. Her words lingered like smoke, impossible to clear, impossible to ignore. She had not planned to say them, had not rehearsed them in the long months of silence, but they had emerged with a clarity that felt inevitable, as though they had been waiting all along for this moment to be set free. Her father lowered his gaze, his shoulders sagging under the invisible weight of her truth. He looked smaller than ever, diminished not by age, but by the collapse of the image he had built of himself. His hands fumbled with the rim of his cup, searching for something to hold on to, but there was nothing left. The authority he had once wielded so easily had dissolved, leaving only a man confronted by the consequences of his own cruelty. She did not soften, did not rush to fill the silence with comfort or apology. For too long, she had carried the burden of his actions, twisting herself into silence to preserve a peace that had never truly existed. Now the burden was his, and she let it rest there, unflinching. Her words had shifted the balance between them, and she would not take them back. They were hers, and they were true, and they had finally been spoken. Her father's breath came uneven, his chest rising and falling as though each inhale was a struggle. He opened his mouth again, but whatever words he sought refused to come. The silence stretched, but it was no longer hers to endure. It belonged to him now, a silence filled with the echoes of what he had broken, and the realization that it could never be mended with pleas alone. And as she stood there, her heart steady, her voice still reverberating in the air, she understood that this confrontation was not the end, but the beginning of something new. She had reclaimed her voice, her truth, her power, and no matter what he said or failed to say, nothing could take that away. The fracture remained, but so did her strength, and in that strength was the promise of a future no longer defined by his rage. His voice cracked as he finally let the words spill, not with the force of anger, but with the fragility of confession. He admitted that his cruelty had never been about her choices alone, but about the terror that had lived inside him for years. Fear of losing control, fear of watching her slip beyond his grasp, fear of her independence shining brighter than the shadow he had cast over her life. Each word was heavy, dragging itself out of him as though it had been buried too long, and for the first time, she saw not the tyrant who had humiliated her, but the frightened man who had hidden behind rage to mask his own weakness. He leaned forward, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the table, his eyes refusing to meet hers. "I was afraid," he whispered, the words almost swallowed by the hum of the cafe. "Afraid of being forgotten, of being left behind." The admission hung in the air, raw and unpolished, and she felt the weight of it settle between them like a stone. It was not an excuse, not a justification, but a revelation that stripped him bare. The man who had once seemed unshakable now revealed himself as fragile, and that fragility unsettled her more than his fury ever had. She studied him in silence, her chest tight with the collision of emotions his confession stirred. Anger still burned, sharp and unrelenting, but beneath it was something else, an unexpected recognition of the humanity she had long denied him. His fear did not absolve him, but it explained the cracks in his armor, the desperation behind his cruelty. For years, he had built himself into a fortress of authority. But now she saw the truth. The fortress had always been hollow, its walls built not from strength, but from fear of collapse. Her father's voice faltered as he continued, each word dragging itself out like a reluctant truth. He spoke of watching her grow, of seeing her become someone he could no longer control, and how that loss had terrified him. He admitted that his rage at the wedding had been less about her choices and more about his own inability to accept that she was no longer his to command. "I thought if I broke you, I could keep you," he said, his voice trembling, and the cruelty of that logic made her stomach twist. It was a confession that revealed not only his fear, but the depth of his selfishness. The cafe around them carried on. oblivious to the storm unfolding at their table. But for her, the world had narrowed to his words. She felt the jagged edges of the broken necklace in her memory, sharper now with the knowledge that it had been torn away not out of hatred, but out of desperation. That truth did not soften the pain, but it reframed it, shifting the wound into something more complex. He had not destroyed her because he despised her, but because he could not bear to lose the version of her he thought he owned. Her breath came uneven, her chest rising and falling as she tried to process the revelation. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him that fear was no excuse for cruelty, that his confession did not erase the humiliation he had inflicted. And yet, she could not deny the shift inside her, the way his words cracked open a space she had not expected. It was not forgiveness, not even understanding, but a recognition that the man before her was no longer the monster she had carried in her memory. He was something smaller, sadder, and infinitely more human. Her father's eyes finally lifted to meet hers, and in them, she saw the truth of his fear. They were not the eyes of a man who sought to dominate, but of one who feared irrelevance, who feared being erased from the story of her life. That fear had driven him to cruelty, had twisted love into possession, had turned protection into control. And now, stripped of his authority, he sat before her as a man undone by the very thing he had tried to prevent. The irony of it was bitter, and she let it linger on her tongue like ash. She did not speak immediately, letting the silence stretch between them, forcing him to sit with the weight of his own words. For once, it was not her silence that carried shame, but his. He shifted uncomfortably, his hands restless, his breath uneven, as though the act of confession had left him exposed in a way he could not endure. She watched him, steady and unflinching, her silence now a mirror reflecting back the truth he had tried so long to bury. The revelation did not heal the fracture between them, but it illuminated it, casting light on the shadows that had shaped their lives. She realized then that his cruelty had never been about her worth, but about his fear of losing it. That knowledge did not erase the pain, but it shifted the burden, placing it back where it belonged. On him. For the first time, she felt the weight of his actions lift slightly from her shoulders, not because he had redeemed himself, but because she no longer carried the blame. And as she sat there, her father hollowed by regret, she understood that this moment was not about reconciliation, but about truth. His fear had been the root of his cruelty, and now it was laid bare, undeniable and irreversible. She did not know what she would do with that truth, whether it would lead to forgiveness or final severance, but she knew this: the power was hers now, and his confession had changed the shape of their story forever. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her bag, pulling out the small cloth pouch she had carried for months. From it, she drew the broken necklace, its jagged edges catching the light of the cafe in sharp, unforgiving glints. She held it in her palm for a long moment, staring at the fragments that had once been whole, fragments that had once bound her to a family she no longer recognized. The weight of it was heavier than its size suggested, a relic of pain and betrayal that had lived in her pocket like a wound she refused to let heal. Her father's eyes widened when he saw it, his breath catching as though the sight alone had struck him. He leaned forward instinctively, his hand twitching as if to reach for it, but she pulled back slightly, her grip tightening. The necklace was not his to reclaim, not anymore. She could feel the heat of his longing, the desperation in his gaze, but she would not let him take it from her hands as easily as he had torn it from her throat. This time, the choice was hers, and she would not surrender it. Slowly, deliberately, she extended her hand and placed the necklace on the table between them. The sound of the metal and beads against the wood was soft, but it carried the weight of finality. She did not push it toward him, did not offer it as a gift or a gesture of reconciliation. Instead, she left it there, a boundary drawn in fragments, a reminder of what had been broken and could not be restored. Her father's hand hovered above it, trembling, but he did not touch it. Her voice was steady when she finally spoke, though her chest ached with the effort of holding it firm. "This is what you left me with," she said, her words slicing through the air with quiet precision. "I can't fix it for you." The sentence landed like a verdict, not shouted, not cruel, but undeniable. It was not just about the necklace. It was about everything he had shattered, everything he had demanded, everything he had destroyed in his fear. The fragments on the table were not just jewelry. They were the embodiment of their fractured bond. Her father's face crumpled, his eyes glistening as he stared at the broken pieces. He looked as though he wanted to speak, to protest, to beg again, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time, he seemed to understand that this was not something he could command or repair with apologies. The necklace was broken, and so was the trust it symbolized. His silence was thick with realization, and she let it hang there, refusing to rescue him from it. She leaned back in her chair, her hands folding in her lap, her gaze steady on him. The act of placing the necklace on the table had shifted something inside her, a release she had not expected. For months she had carried the fragments as a burden, a reminder of her pain. Now, by setting them down, she had returned the weight to where it belonged. It was no longer hers to carry, no longer her responsibility to mend. The choice to leave it broken was hers, and it was liberating. Her father's shoulders sagged, his hands falling uselessly to his sides. He looked smaller than ever, diminished not just by age, but by the truth laid bare before him. The necklace glinted between them, a silent witness to the fracture that could not be undone. He seemed to realize that no matter how much he begged, no matter how much regret he confessed, the pieces would never fit together again. The finality of that truth pressed down on him, and she could see it in the way his chest rose and fell unevenly. The cafe's ordinary rhythm continued around them, but at their table time seemed suspended. She felt the weight of her decision settle into her bones, not as sorrow, but as strength. She had not forgiven him, had not absolved him, but she had reclaimed her power. By refusing to fix what he had broken, she had drawn a line that could not be crossed. The necklace remained between them, not as a bridge, but as a barrier, a reminder that some things are meant to stay shattered. Her father finally lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. His silence was not the silence of authority, but of defeat, of recognition that the power he once held over her was gone. She did not gloat, did not revel in his collapse, but she did not soften either. The choice she had made was not about punishing him, but about freeing herself. The necklace was his legacy, not hers, and she would no longer carry it. And as she rose from her chair, leaving the fragments on the table, she felt lighter than she had in months. The necklace no longer belonged in her pocket, no longer belonged in her life. It was his to face, his to reckon with, his to mourn. She walked away without looking back, her steps steady, her heart unburdened. The choice had been made, and in that choice, she had claimed something far greater than reconciliation. She had claimed herself. She rose from the table with a steadiness that surprised even her, the fragments of the old necklace still glinting between them like a wound left open. Her father's eyes followed her, desperate, pleading, but she did not falter. For the first time, she felt no need to explain herself, no need to justify her silence or her choices. She had carried the weight of his rage for too long, and now she was setting it down. The clarity that filled her chest was not soft or forgiving, but sharp and liberating, a truth she could finally claim as her own. As she stepped outside, the air felt different, cooler, lighter, as though the world itself had shifted in recognition of her choice. The city moved around her, indifferent to the storm she had just endured, and that indifference was strangely comforting. She was no longer defined by the eyes of others, no longer bound by the expectations of a family that had tried to shape her into something she was not. Each step away from the cafe was a step into herself, into a life that belonged only to her. Her partner was waiting just beyond the corner, his presence steady, his eyes searching hers for the answers she had not yet spoken. She didn't need to explain. He saw it in the way she carried herself, in the way her shoulders no longer sagged under invisible weight. He reached for her hand, and this time, she gripped his firmly, not as someone seeking rescue, but as someone choosing to walk beside him. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was full, alive, brimming with the unspoken promise of what lay ahead. Later that evening, in the quiet of their home, she opened the small box he had given her weeks before. Inside lay the necklace he had chosen for her, simple yet radiant, unburdened by history, untainted by expectation. She lifted it carefully, feeling the smoothness of the chain against her fingers. So different from the jagged edges she had carried for months. It was not a replacement for what had been broken, but a symbol of something new, something chosen freely. She slipped the necklace around her neck, the clasp clicking softly into place. The weight of it was gentle, not oppressive, resting against her skin like a whisper of possibility. She caught her reflection in the mirror and saw not the girl who had been humiliated, not the daughter who had been silenced, but the woman who had endured, who had spoken, who had chosen. The necklace gleamed faintly in the light, not as a reminder of the past, but as a marker of the future she was building. Her father's face lingered in her mind, hollowed by regret, but it no longer consumed her. His plea, his confession, his brokenness, they were his to carry now, not hers. She had given back the fragments of the old necklace, returned the weight of his choices to him, and in doing so, freed herself. The clarity she felt was not forgiveness, but it was enough. It was the kind of clarity that allowed her to breathe without the past pressing against her lungs. She touched the new necklace lightly, her fingers tracing its smooth curve, and felt a quiet strength settle into her bones. This was not about erasing what had happened, nor about pretending the scars did not exist. It was about choosing what came next, about stepping into a life defined not by fear or control, but by love, resilience, and self-determination. The necklace was not just jewelry, it was a declaration, a vow to herself that she would never again be silenced. Her partner entered the room, his eyes softening when he saw the necklace resting against her collarbone. He didn't speak, didn't need to. Instead, he smiled, and in that smile she saw the reflection of the life they were building together. Imperfect, fragile, but theirs. She smiled back, not as someone seeking approval, but as someone who had finally found her own reflection in the world around her. The night stretched on, quiet and unhurried, and for the first time in months, she felt at peace. The broken necklace was gone, left behind on a table where it belonged, and in its place was something new, something chosen. She lay down beside her partner, the necklace cool against her skin, and closed her eyes with the certainty that she had stepped into a future she had claimed for herself. And so the story closed not with reconciliation, not with forgiveness, but with clarity. She had walked away from the ruins of the past and into the light of her own becoming. The new necklace gleamed softly in the dark, a symbol not of what had been lost, but of what she had chosen to create. It was the quiet triumph of a woman who had endured, who had spoken, who had claimed her life as her own, and in that clarity she found the strength to begin again.